everybody's ready for spring break. It's very warm today. But before we go to spring break, I'm excited to say we have a very nice seminar here from Kevin Pixley from CIMMYT. So Dr. Pixley went to high school. I can't deal with this. Throws me off.
Still doing it? Yes.
And then you can speak as you is it coming through here? Yeah,
You want me to turn off my microphone here?
Say that again?
Should I turn this on?
yeah. This is muted. Should come through here.
Are the speakers on the computer muted?
Yeah.
That's why it's weird.
Speakers here.
How about I just turn this on?
23 people online too, so then we'll do the
Well,
presentation.
you could hear from here on the. I can plug this in the book.
Yeah, we can try that. And then just repeat questions from the audience.
I'll turn this on.
Sorry for the technical delay here, folks.
Okay, now is it okay?
Is that good? Is it yours? Is it yours? Mhm.
Okay, can you hear us?
Now he's got to mute his computer and then we'll be okay, hopefully.
Is that better? Anything?
Okay,
I'm not
Can you hear us?
now just check if people can hear us.
Can you hear us?
All right, well. Were we just talking about the challenges of teaching online last night? So this is one of them. All right, well, I was saying that Kevin he didn't grow up, went to high school, I know, in Mexico City. And that's how he became familiar with CIMMYT. So he visited CIMMYT during high school. And then he ended up going to college for agriculture. He did his bachelor's at Purdue, his master's in plant physiology at the University of Florida, and his PhD in plant breeding at Iowa State University, where he's studying with Ken Fry, the small grain breeder at the time. And then from there, in 1990, he joined CIMMYT, and he initially started off as a maize breeder working in Eastern and Southern Africa out of the station in Zimbabwe. He worked there for 11 years. And then after that point, he took on a directorship position in the global maize breeding program and the genetic resources program at their headquarters in near Mexico City in Texcoco in CIMMYT. And he's currently stationed at the CIMMYT headquarters in Texcoco, where he's the CIMMYT partner, and directs the Dryland crops breeding program and interim lead for the global wheat program. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Aaron, and thanks everyone for coming to the seminar, and thanks for the invitation to join you for this seminar series. I hope people can hear okay, who are connected. If not, somebody flag me down and we'll try to fix it. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project that I worked on with, I don't know, about 20 co-authors, mostly working in dryland crops across Africa, sorghum, pearl millet, groundnut in particular. And is really looking at what we're going to have to do. And many of you are plant breeders, as I was anyway, until I moved more into research leadership. And thinking about what that implies for plant breeders, how we can redesign, if we need to redesign crop varieties to win the race between climate change and food security. And some of this work anyway is in this publication from last year, if you're interested in looking it up. But I'm only going to show a couple slides about climate change because you're all very familiar with it and living it very well this winter here in Minnesota. But really, Africa is one of the most climate vulnerable regions of the world, or parts of Africa anyway. And in this clipping, it talks about how the Northern Africa and Southern Africa are going to be some of the hardest hit in terms of declining precipitation, at least in most of the forecast models. And of course, it's a culture, it's a region that depends very much on household agriculture for feeding most of the population. You've probably seen this figure, but it shows for maize and for wheat, what are the current trends in production. So you see the line, the yellow line, and the sort of orangish line below, showing you the current rates. And if we continue on current trends, what will be the production in going towards 2050? The dashed lines indicates the projected demand for these two crops. And then the red line below is the potential negative effects of climate change based on various estimates, as you can see on the right-hand side here, that in general, you have a yield decrease for every degree centigrade, and you also have more insect and pest and disease problems as temperatures go up, changing spectra as well of diseases. So these are challenges that as breeders we're dealing with, and we have to continue dealing with in order to overcome this potential shortfall in food production. So I was interested to see, okay, what are plant breeders doing currently, looking at these challenges, this daunting challenge that's ahead. And here's a pretty interesting paper that we found in Plants about 3 years ago. And it looked at 19 developing countries and surveyed breeders in those countries to see, what are you doing? Are you concerned about climate change? And if so, how is that impacting on your breeding program? And what are you doing to address these challenges in your breeding program? And in fact, the paper does indicate that most breeders are thinking about climate change and are clearly concerned about it. And in general, however, their efforts are aimed at intensifying the breeding work on traits that they're already working on. Just let's try to do it more and faster. And the vast majority of breeders are working on drought tolerance, pests, and diseases, the sorts of things on the previous slide. And the summary from that paper is basically this one statement here, that in recent years, there's been an increased urgency with which breeders are working on traits that already had high priority in their long-term breeding work. And this might be good enough, but I'm also concerned that, you know, sometimes if you just keep doing the same thing, you maybe shouldn't expect a different result. And so we examined this through this paper and some of the thoughts that I'm going to share with you in the rest of this seminar. So here's an interesting map about expected changes in temperature and in precipitation for Africa. And most of this seminar will focus on Africa, while they do have some slides from South Asia. And these are models looking at the plus 1.5 degrees C scenario on the left set of maps. On the left group here is for temperature. On these two maps on the right are precipitation, expected changes in precipitation. And of course, with 2 degrees, it's more intensive, and darker red means hotter or greater increase in temperature. One of the things that was interesting to me, and as I read these models, is that there are some areas that are expected to have increased precipitation, particularly across some of the Sahel which is some of the driest regions today, well, they will have higher temperatures, of course, but they may also have additional precipitation, which means in general hotter and in some areas somewhat wetter, although as on the earlier slide, northern is going to be drier as well as some parts of southern. So then I tried to think, okay, what happens if your temperature is getting hotter, rainfall is becoming more, what happens to the current cropping patterns, cropping systems? And I didn't have good examples from West Africa, so I went to some literature from South Asia, and I found a couple examples, Vietnam and Indonesia on the next slide. And you can see in Vietnam currently, these are cropping patterns involving maize. So these two papers focus on maize. And you can see in different parts of Vietnam, there's, I don't know how many that is, about 15 different common relay crops, different common ways of farming that currently rely on current rainfall and current temperature patterns to enable these types of, maize, rice, or rice, maize, soybean, maize, etc. And you can see on the calendar on the right, the pattern of when they would plant and harvest each of those crops. And so what you can immediately imagine is, okay, if temperatures are going up, that means it's taking fewer days to accumulate the growing degree days to mature a crop. And if rainfall patterns are changing, you may not be able to plant or harvest when you used to. So we can expect that there are going to be some changes in these cropping patterns and these relay cropping systems that are currently common or that were common at the time of this publication. And so similarly for Indonesia, there's a series of different regions of Indonesia, most common relay crop patterns at the moment. And what we expect is that as rainfall and temperature patterns change, so will some of these cropping systems. And I'll talk a little bit about what I discussed with some of you yesterday about even what may be happening in Minnesota or parts of the US. But if you're going to have different cropping patterns, you may need some different traits. And this is what we're getting at in this paper and what I want to share with you today. You may need to now be planting a crop when there's excess moisture in the soil because it's actually overlapping now with the end of a rainy season. Or you may be experiencing heat or drought at different times. And something that I've thought about a lot in this last trip to South Asia is maybe the need for rapid dry down in some of our crops in order to be able to, without minimizing yield, shorten crop duration or have earlier maturity. In South Asia now, this is a really interesting study that looks at optimizing resource use and maximizing margins of return to investments in cropping systems in South Asia. And they really looked at what are the most common relay crop now is rice followed by wheat. But this study really points out some options that would be more profitable and probably also more input use efficient. And what they found is that, for example, the rice wheat was significantly least productive of all these. And you can see the gross margin on the right-hand column here, indicating with the highest gross margin return is this 2,851 Australian dollars per hectare. And that one is for a rice wheat jute rotation or relay cropping system. But what I like about this study is it also looks at CO2 equivalent emissions. And the most interesting one for me is the labor, which is this arrow here. And it indicates that, of course, the most profitable one, unfortunately, happens to be also the one that requires the most labor. And so here, one of the themes that I'm going to mention throughout this seminar is that many farmers, particularly if you're a smallholder farmer, are not really commercial farmers. They're never going to make substantial income from farming 1 acre of land or 1.5 acres of land. So they're very interested in farming systems that will reduce their labor requirement or that will have very limited labor requirement so that they can actually take their labor off farm and generate income, as I think happens also with many farmers in the US, right? They farm part-time and they actually also hold a part-time or another job at the same time in order to supplement their income. So all these things are important. Intensifying and diversifying cropping systems may maximize productivity and profitability, might maximize water use efficiency. I think one of these, maybe it's on another study, talks a lot about water use efficiency, but also we need to be watching labor efficiency. With climate change, this is also from parts of India. I think the easiest thing to observe in this series of photos on the left, you have from 2003 to 2008, what was the rice harvest time. On the right hand, both the map and the bar graph shows you about a decade later. And you can see, especially in the map, there's a lot more red, which means it's getting later, the harvest of rice. And that means that there's a shorter window of time to turn around the crop from rice and plant the subsequent wheat crop. And so what this paper argues, and you'll see on the next slide, one of the solutions, is that there are strong incentives to farmers for burning their residue, their rice residue, before, so they can get in and plant the wheat crop. But there are laws against it. And there's huge problems with actually smog or burning smoke into Delhi and other parts of India because of the burning of the residue. So replacing rice with less water demanding crops isn't accepted because there are so many subsidies allowed for electricity, and rice is of course the crop of preference. And what you're going to see is this next slide will show you what they want is shorter duration variety so that you can harvest sooner, and then cropping and livestocking systems are hugely important. And one of the technologies that CIMMYT has been working with is this implement called the Happy Seeder, which allows you to plant directly your wheat into the rice stubble without having to burn it. And this is a publication in journal Science indicating the benefits of this Happy Seeder in terms of reducing the burning and conserving water, and most importantly, shortening the period. I actually witnessed this process where the combine is harvesting rice, and just behind it, a couple 100 meters behind it, you're planting the subsequent wheat crop. I threw these in just because they're kind of cool pictures that I was 2 weeks ago in this case, Nepal, but also because I want you to see these are stacks of rice straw. And there's another one in this other house. So they're all saving rice straw. It's valuable as animal feed. And so they're using, here you can see, these are actually taller than the house itself in this other right-hand side picture. So there's huge value also for that rice straw. So when we start recommending conservation agriculture technologies, like the Happy Seeder, they often want to actually use that rice straw, if not burn it to get rid of it quickly. So there are competing interests for the use. And something that's been discovered is, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, is that the wheat varieties that can actually be planted into this heavy rice residue may be different, and in fact, in many cases are different than those that can grow in a conventional tillage or that can perform well under conventional tillage. So there may be need to develop varieties that actually perform specifically in the cropping systems that are emerging. So then that brings me to our study in West Africa, across Africa, not just West Africa. And what we looked at, we surveyed about 600 scientists of these 6 crops that are listed here: pearl millet and sorghum, maize, groundnut, cowpea, and common bean. We surveyed them about 3 things. And the first one we asked them was, okay, what are the factors that are going to drive changes in the agronomy and in the cropping systems as climate is changing? And I've sort of separated them here into, the top ones are the ones that came out most often mentioned. So let's just take a quick look at those. There's going to be increased frequency of drought, so that will drive changes, increased climate variability and extreme events, fewer rainfalls, but more intense, increased demand due to population growth, emerging and re-emerging pests and diseases. Of course, it's getting hotter, and problems of soil erosion and degradation. You can see many others, but those are the main ones that these 600 respondents thought are going to drive changes in the cropping systems. So then, okay, what's going to change in terms of agronomy? What are the practices most likely to be adopted by farmers in the next decades in response to these challenges? And the top one in both of these are two examples, one for the groundnut respondents, and the other one here is for pearl millet respondents, and mechanization. So there's really, you think about smallholder farmers don't want mechanization, but in fact, their top most likely to adopt innovation is going to be more mechanization. That's so they can use their labor to do something else. Early sowing to increase crop yield, but also for crop rotations, conservation agriculture, and intensification of cropping systems by intercropping or relay cropping or double cropping appeared for both. And really it was a theme throughout the 6 crops, which I won't show you all 6 of them. And then we get to the part most interesting to me as a plant breeder. So what does this mean for a plant breeder in terms of traits that maybe we need to be breeding for? Is there something different that we should be, or should we just be like those 19 country breeders that we talked about a few minutes ago? Just do the same thing, but faster and better. And so what we found is that we asked these 600 respondents to rank a series of traits and to nominate their own traits if they had other ones on 2 categories. One is potential impact. If we had high stover quality, would that be impactful or would it not be impactful? So the higher up on the y-axis, the more impactful the scientists believe it would be. And then the x-axis is how innovative would it be? So if it's not innovative, it means we're already doing it, so it's nothing new. If it's further to the right on the axis here, then that means it would be something new that's not happening, or that's not happening very much today. And these are the sorts of traits that came out as innovative and potentially impactful. And they include adaptation for mechanization. I think particularly groundnut comes out. How can you mechanically harvest groundnut in smallholder farming systems? Would be a huge benefit. Crop systems, so how to get a better relay crop that would maximize yields, such as or maximize return on investment, such as those examples from South Asia. Stay green has come up a lot, and it's mainly because they want to use the stover as animal feed, so they would prefer if it stays green longer, and that's related to stover quality, and number 2. And early vigor, I think, is important because it can emerge from stubble or it can emerge from a poorly prepared seedbed in a relay cropping system. And here's some of the reasons why. To enhance cropping systems flexibility, increase productivity, reduce risk, livestock, and so the stay green, the stover quality, in a significant number of years, you're not going to get a grain crop, or you're not going to get significant grain production, particularly in the more challenging environments. And so you want to at least get feed for your animals through high quality stover or stay green. So we're doing a lot of breeding for dual purpose crops that are valuable both as food and feed. Reducing labor is very important, and in some cases adding value. There are some examples of traits that would add value, such as stover quality. Here's 2 other crops. So the first 2, I didn't mention it, but the first 2 were pearl millet and sorghum, so 2 cereals. Then we had two legume crops, groundnut and cowpea. Surprisingly, fairly similar traits were identified as likely to be impactful and to some extent innovative or not being done today. Apologies for ugly color scheme here, but I wanted to be quick and dramatic. So we have, in the paper, we talk about some of the characteristics that were prioritized by surveys, and we discuss in the text of the paper. Then there were some that were prioritized, but we didn't have time to discuss or word count to discuss in the paper. And then we proposed, and we had experts for each of these crops, and they proposed what they thought were blind spots that people really weren't identifying as priorities, but that really should be or might be important traits to work on. And you see some things like microbiome, root architecture, low soil fertility tolerance, low soil phosphorus, in pearl millet, bird resistance, tremendously important. These are all challenging problems for breeding. In fact, some of them may be fairly intractable for breeding, and perhaps that is actually a reason to invest effort into them, if in fact they can be very impactful. But my favorite one is this one, and it wasn't picked up by anyone else in the study, and I discussed it yesterday, and I want to just share it with you right now, and that is nighttime temperatures. This graph is from Obregón, which is in northern Mexico, where CIMMYT has its really large wheat research station. And it shows a series of yield trials. Oops, I think I went. A series of yield trials in which the average minimum nighttime temperature ranges by more than 4 degrees centigrade. So average nighttime temperatures this is between January and April, so over a long period of time, over the season basically, more than 4 degrees C difference. And as it gets hotter, the yield trends downward. So nighttime temperatures going up really had a very significant impact on yield of the wheat varieties in the trials grown at Obregón in Mexico. But there is one variety identified that actually seems to buck this trend. And so what's interesting is, why? Why is it bucking that trend? And that's what we really need to understand so that we can try to identify and breed for this sort of trait that would allow tolerance to higher nighttime temperatures. And you can see this is from the previous graphs. Low nighttime respiration was not identified as impactful or as innovative by most of the survey respondents, but to me, that's one that really has some potential opportunity. And yesterday I was talking with Walid Sadok, and he's actually been doing some work in this area, some really interesting discussions we had yesterday about some of the genotypes that actually transpire more are better able to keep cooler canopy temperature and might be advantageous, particularly if you're in a situation where water is not limiting. So I think it'd be interesting to work more with him and maybe with some of you exploring nighttime physiology and how we can prevent not only, well, mainly losses of photosynthate through respiration, but transpiration may be or may not be the answer depending on water availability. So coming back to the story from Africa, this map shows, okay, the first 4 columns of the maps are 4 different models. And the 5th column, the furthest right, top and bottom, are the average of the 4 models on the left. So maybe just focus on these two, E1 and E2. And that's the scenario at plus 1.5 or plus 2. And that's the changing growth duration. And what we see is that you're going to have in the dark red examples as much as 2 weeks probably shorter growth duration for a maize crop. This was a study for maize, just because you're getting more growing degree day accumulation during what would be the normal growth season. And what surprises me is that everywhere I've gone, including across South Asia, nobody wants longer maturing crops. Everybody wants early. And I said, but you're going to have 2 more weeks to do something with, at least. Why don't you want a longer season? Obviously, longer duration yields more, right? Well, yes, if you have a reasonable season. But I think, to me, my conclusion is that this strong desire for earliness is all about risk aversion. It's all about avoiding risk. You want to get that crop in and out and hope that you have at least a 2.5 month or 2 to 3 month period that's of reasonable conditions and you can get a crop. And if you're lucky, okay, you plant another one and maybe you have another chance to get another crop. Instead of betting on a 6 month or a 7 month crop that could, in theory, yield much more than the sum of those 2 shorter duration crops. And if we're breeding for earlier maturity, which, believe me, that's what's being demanded in most Africa, most South Asia, then we're going to need some different types of traits, some new cultivars that are able to cope with these. I mean, if you're going to take this region in West Africa, and instead of growing 1 crop, grow 2, that means your second crop is going to be planted when it's still raining into a wetter soil. And you're going to have to be able to cope. You're going to have to be able to harvest it. You're going to have to be able to previous crop and plant the second crop under different conditions than you're currently doing. So these are some pictures I took just last year near Kano, Nigeria. And every field I stopped and looked at had some form of intercropping. And most of this is intercropping, and you could even call it this biggest picture towards the bottom. It's almost relay more than inter, but they plant the second crop while the first crop is still in the field. So in this case, in the bottom, you see they've already harvested probably pearl millet, and there's cowpea coming along in the remaining field behind. And the pictures above are showing cowpeas and groundnuts growing in between sorghum or millet. So this is how farmers are growing crops in most of the regions of West Africa. I thought this was really unique, except yesterday when I was talking with Anderson, with Jim, he mentioned that something like this is also happening here in Minnesota, or he's getting ready for it here in Minnesota. And it's a concept that was new to me when I wrote this paper. And that is, you know, if you're going to grow a relay crop or an intercrop, in this graph, you show an oilseed crop, in this case, winter oilseed. Before harvest, you've already been planting the soybean into it, and then it starts growing for about almost 2 months before you harvest your first crop. So you're going to need a variety that's able to emerge and start growing in the shade of your oilseed crop if you're going to do this. And that's what we're talking about in these cropping systems, where you really need to look at, and I hadn't heard these terms before, but this is general and specific mixing ability, just like we talk about GCA and SCA in classical plant breeding, but the ability of a variety to perform better than most in this sort of a mixing relay system or other sorts of rotations or crops, cropping, intercropping systems. There's a very common intercrop in Malawi and in parts of Southern Africa, which is maize with pigeon pea. And I have little doubt that there must be maize varieties that take better advantage of that intercrop situation, and maybe related to the microbiome in the rhizosphere, or maybe ability to tolerate the shading that occurs. But for some reason, some varieties do better than others. And the conclusion from this paper is that, you know, cultivar development for intercropping should begin with a decision to breed for intercropping systems. And this is quite controversial. I've presented this to several people, and some breeders come to me and say, I don't believe it. I don't think this is right. And that's great if some of you disagree, but I think it's worth giving some thought whether we should actually be breeding in intercrop systems, or if you're breeding for oil crop soybean future in Minnesota, should you actually be doing this in your research farms and selecting your soybean varieties after planting them into the oilseed crop here in Minnesota? The only place I've really seen this being done was at IITA, also in Nigeria. This is Osman Bukar's, he's a cowpea breeder. And so he's selecting cowpea. These are cowpea plants growing in between rows of pearl millet. I think he probably planted the cowpea too late, but nonetheless, he's trying and he's working on it. But so he'll be able to select cowpea varieties that we're able to tolerate better than others the pressure from having the pearl millet crops shading them and around them. So moving then to a related topic, and I'll just have a couple slides about this. And the point I want to make is that what you're learning today and what we're using today as breeders are very effective and powerful tools for plant breeding. There's a lot of genomics enabled plant breeding. This is a paper by Gary Atlin and colleagues. You probably know Gary Atlin. He's at the Gates Foundation. He's been very instrumental at CIMMYT in some of what I talked to. There were several grad students I met for lunch yesterday with, and I talked about changes we're making in breeding at CIMMYT to accelerate the cycle of breeding from 6.5, 7 years down to about 3 years per breeding cycle now. A lot of this is what's illustrated in this table. And of course, if you're doing your breeding cycle in half the time, you could expect approximately double the genetic gain over time if you're as effective or as accurate, which you probably lose a little bit of accuracy, but still, you're going to get a lot more genetic gain in a period of time by reducing your breeding cycle. So there are many methods, and he talks about them, or he and co-authors talk about them. I'm not going to dwell on them here, but the point is we can, in fact, be much more effective and faster, achieve faster genetic gains using genomics tools that are available to us today. Genome editing may also be an option for some, particularly for qualitative traits. We're doing quite a bit of work in genome editing at CIMMYT. Particularly, we have a product almost ready to go to field in Kenya with Kenya Agricultural Livestock Research Organization for disease resistance to a viral disease, maize lethal necrosis. And you can see several other traits that are being worked on within the CGIAR, which is the group of centers of which CIMMYT is a member. So again, a powerful tool that can help us accelerate progress once we know what trait we need to improve. I want to include this slide just to indicate how we're working. CIMMYT is working in Africa today. We are co-designing and co-developing breeding programs together with partners from the public sector in different countries. And we've formed steering committees. This list here is from West and Central Africa. There's another one for Eastern and Southern Africa. And they are multidisciplinary, socioeconomists, breeders, quantitative geneticists, pathologists, and we together decide what are the priorities that need to be done and who's going to do what. And this has been a really great way of identifying where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses. You know, where can we evaluate effectively striga resistance, a parasitic weed resistance, and do it on behalf of the whole group of countries that are involved in a network. So it's really about co-developing plans and co-implementing breeding programs that are more holistic, that think about the agronomy, that think about the cropping systems, and that think about the socioeconomics. I'll have one slide about that in just a moment. So coming now to a summary, we're really thinking, or I've been thinking a lot about, you know, breeding new genotypes that really are designed for cropping systems that they're going to be grown in. And I think I was a maize breeder most of my career, but I think today it's no longer possible in most parts of the world to just be a maize breeder. You have to be thinking about how it fits into the cropping systems, how it matches sustainability goals. I heard a lot yesterday about the Evergreen project.
Forever
What's that?
Forever green.
Forever. That's even better than ever. Forever green. Thanks. The Forever Green project. Well, this is here to stay. This is real, and we have to ensure that agriculture stays within planetary boundaries. And so to do that, we may have to be looking at more of the questions that I've been trying to share with you today. And I think we have to be willing to expect a few surprises, traits that we aren't working on today, but that really will be important in 20 years' time. And that's the challenge to today's breeders, is to anticipate what they are. And what I tell my colleagues is, okay, we may get a couple of them wrong, but still we can start breeding on them today, and then we can discard the ones that we realize probably weren't the best choices. But we got to make sure that we include those that are going to be future essential traits. So in this work, we had three main hypotheses and a couple of conclusions. One of them is that we're going to really have to think beyond our favorite crop. So I'm not just a maize breeder anymore. I'm a maize breeder in a rotation with cowpea, or I'm a maize breeder in a rotation with bambara nut, and I need to make sure that my maize variety creates the greatest net return on the farmer's field, including labor considerations and other socioeconomic considerations. In crop varieties for a new or modified cropping system might require different traits, the second hypothesis, than today's varieties, and some may be counterintuitive. I would say longer season maize variety would make sense. Farmers want shorter, and they have good reasons for it. And the other one is that we have these modern tools today that really make us to be very precise on whatever we set out to do, which means we have to be extra careful about what targets we aim for, because we're pretty likely to achieve them. So we need, the conclusions then is we need transdisciplinary teams that are ready to take on new traits for these interactions, and that the biggest challenge to win the race with climate change may actually be identifying what traits to breed for, rather than how to breed for them. I probably should skip this one, but we still have a couple minutes. It's just to point out that even this is a recent 2021, I think. I don't see it. It should be somewhere on the screen here. Recent publication of a very extensive scoping study about what factors influence adoption of new crop varieties in developing countries. And the main thing that came out of this is that farmers don't look just at varieties. They look at the whole system. They look at how they're going to fit within a cropping system. They look at modifying planting dates, changing crop diversification, crop rotations. They look at investments in livestock, and single component interventions like a new variety are generally not adopted unless they fit within a system. So it pretty much validates or confirms some of the hypotheses that I was presenting. And then what I call the bonus slide, I saw this truck and I managed to get a picture of it, and I asked, what is it? And those are sorghum stalks, or at least I was assured they're sorghum stalks. And they're on their way to market in Kano. And each stock can get as much as US 10 cents. So there's a bunch of money riding on the back of this truck. And I asked, well, why is a sorghum stalk so valuable? And they explained to me that sorghum stalks burn at just the right temperature to bake this bread, which is gurasa, which is really a favorite. You see it being sold. There's people with baskets of it on their head walking all around the streets in Kano. We bought some. I tried it. It's really, really quite delicious. This is what it looks like from one side and then from the other side. And yet this commands a special price because it's used locally to produce this type of bread. And that just reminds me, before I fly in from Mexico and recommend that they should incorporate all these stocks so that they can have a more sustainable cropping system and better, healthier soils, I better realize that this is actually probably a bigger source of income for them than the actual grain of sorghum that they're growing. And so you really have to fit the socioeconomics into the study. I don't have time to discuss this, but I wanted to show you a couple pretty pictures from Nepal. This is, it's related to the socioeconomics. We do a lot of work on participatory evaluations. This is a trial. You can see the plots. Maybe I'm trying to circle them. They're fairly large plots, maybe the size of almost from here to the curtain over there. And these are probably about 8 or 9 varieties or potential varieties of wheat. These two gentlemen are the farmers who were showing us their field, and they are growing this, what they call a mother trial. Mother because there's baby trials, which are just 2 or 3 of a subset, and they get grown by farmers who don't want to invest so much area in evaluating the full mother trial. And from here you get qualitative data. They then, we get yield data, but we're actually more interested in, did you like it? Why did you like it? What didn't you like about it? And these qualitative types of information inform variety release and commercialization decisions. So thanks to co-authors of the paper on redesigning crops. Thanks also to the many, many survey respondents. And thanks to all of you for your interest and for inviting me to share some of my thoughts with you today.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Any questions for Dr. Pixley? Yeah, Kevin.
I was just thinking about the, how you were thinking it would make more sense to have a much longer growing season, yet the farmers were shorter. But I guess, with global change of temperatures and things, that we're getting a lot more fluctuation. And so I think they're quite warranted in thinking that the longer I have, the bigger the risk that there's going to be some calamity that kills my whole crop. So better to just get something than get something.
Exactly. That's the conclusion I've come to as well. And the trait that I'm thinking about now is, let's look at quick dry down. I mean, in maize, this is such an important trait in temperate regions, right? Because you want to maximize the accumulation of vegetative growth pre-flowering, then you want to mature that thing as quickly as you can. And I don't think that's been looked at in very many other crops. And that could be an opportunity to sort of compromise between earliness and yield that you sacrifice for that earliness.
But if you harvest before the end of the rains, you have the question of drying the maize. But that was a problem with us in drying some material in high altitudes. If it dried, if it matured before the end of the rains, we had trouble. Somehow they had to dry it. That's going to cost energy.
Yeah, well, the idea would be that you'd want it to quickly dry down and actually reach dry harvest maturity in time. The problem is you're going to have rain, it's going to be raining on it, and it might be rotting and sprouting and creating other problems. That's why you need characteristics that will enable, or maybe you plant the maize second and plant something else before in the relay. But yeah, there's going to be new challenges which may require different characteristics in your varieties.
Another problem with high temperatures, you're going to change the disease regime. You go from the lower altitude diseases to the higher altitude diseases, basically doing that, reversing that process. You're going to have to change what your disease resistance regime is in those crops.
Yeah, at least in maize, which is where I worked most of my career, it's a lot easier to go uphill than downhill, in the sense that, as you go up to cooler environments, you tend to have fewer diseases, but when you go downhill into the hotter, you have more disease problems. But that's what's happening with increasing temperatures. Basically, you're bringing the tropics to Minnesota, and you're already getting tar spot in maize, and you're going to be getting new diseases you've never seen before as temperatures continue to go up.
Yeah, I'm surprised, even within the different cropping systems and different crops are used, don't you see yield as the biggest limiting factor? I mean, I'm doing some work with a couple NGOs in Sierra Leone, and they grow groundnut, sesame, cowpea, maize for fresh use. But the biggest problem we see within each of those crops in the cropping season is yield. We've been able to provide quality seed by storing and maintaining the seed, fertilizer, and just better cropping systems. We're getting 3-fold time yield with the same variety. I mean, even within the cropping system, I call it back to Borlaug basics. Quality seed, fertilizer. We use glyphosate a few days before to kill weeds. That reduces the need for weeding during the season. I think we're missing some basics here sometimes.
No, I think yield is always important. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think any farmer is not interested in yield. They all are interested in yield. But I think they're also very much interested in other qualities that perhaps we don't think about so much. An interesting story, I've worked in Mexico for many, many years, and we have a research station for maize, Tlaltizapan. And we had, of course, workers that lived in the nearby communities. And one time I asked them, are you growing some of these hybrids that we're growing these trials. You're spending your whole day taking data and harvesting and planting and taking care of these trials. Are you interested in growing some of these in your home, in your plots? And I said, no, not really. I said, why not? Oh, well, because I like the variety that I'm growing. Well, how much does it yield? 2 or 3 tons per hectare. And these trials are getting 8-9 tons per hectare. Well, wouldn't you like to do that? No, I have enough area. I get enough maize from my field. So, but you could plant half the area and do something else with the other half. No, but I like my maize. I like the variety that I've been growing and that my parents were growing. And so you get into this, well, but you could grow another vegetable or something else in that other area. Yeah, but that would be more work. And I'm working here at CIMMYT, so I don't have time. So in the end, they weren't really interested. And I was surprised they weren't stealing seed or asking for seed. They didn't even want seed of the hybrids that we were growing that yielded 3 times what they were getting. So it's not always about only yield, but most farmers do. And then the other part of the story would be most farmers that we work with aren't commercial farmers. They sell very erratically. I mean, sometimes they'll sell in excess, or if they need money to pay school fees or something for their kids, they'll sell some grain reluctantly. But many of them aren't really participants in formal markets. And that also applies to purchasing inputs. You know, they don't really have a lot of income that they're going to invest in purchasing inputs. So you have to reach a certain farm size and farm objectives when you really switch over to thinking about maximizing productivity and
The
profits.
basic problem in much of Africa is just enough food to feed themselves. And they may have some off crop like sesame, like they do in Sierra Leone, provide some income beyond that, but they're still looking for the yield for their basic crop to feed themselves and their families. And I think that's still the biggest issue in most of Africa. I mean, maybe not in Kenya or Niger, but some of the more developed, what I would call developing countries, but most of them are still undeveloped.
And I think part of it's agronomy. I mean, there's many ways. We do have to increase yields, there's no doubt. And farmers do want higher yield. I mean, if you want a low yielding or a high yielding, yeah, right, the high yielding, but there's a lot of ifs and buts and they want something for livestock. I mean, livestock is in fact their bank account. That's where they save for a rainy day is in livestock. So they need to feed their livestock also.
I have a couple of them online. You indicated from your paper that nutritional enhancement was a key trait for enhancement. Is there a notion of what that means for a human perspective? Is nutrition expressed just as a function of yield? More yield equals better nutrition.
No, I think a lot of the talk about nutrition is going back to biofortification. And there are many governments, and I was working mostly with public sector breeders that are governmental employees, and many governments are in fact implementing policies to improve the nutritional value of staple crops, such as maize and sorghum and millet and rice, by mainly enriching them with micronutrients. It could be zinc, could be iron, it could be provitamin A carotenoids. And so these are, when they talk about nutritional value, it's often this that they're talking about. Also in wheat and in last couple of weeks, I heard a lot about looking for resistant starch, looking for low glycemic index wheats, which they see as a premium market opportunity. But in general, we're looking at nutritional security as opposed to caloric security when we talk about nutritional improvement in the crops.
Well, I was surprised at how quickly some preferences can change. When I was working mostly on white maize, as I mentioned yesterday. So I introduced a yellow maize, which I didn't think would take off as a niche market. But I went back like almost two and a half decades later, and it completely changed over to the yellow. And I asked why, and they said, well, we heard it's healthy. We hadn't tested it for provitamin A, but that's what they heard and just spread.
So there is, I mean, if there's awareness, there is interest in more nutritious food. I mean, that, nutrition education is something that really is powerful. And so, yeah, people do want a healthier diet.
The other thing I had a question about is, strider resistance didn't pop out in the preference survey, and I was surprised. It's so prevalent across West Africa. And so,
I think it's mentioned, but it didn't come out as,
it's mentioned, but
yeah, and quite a few programs are actually working on striga resistance. I don't know how effectively. I think, the IITA maize is probably a positive exception. I think they have been, at least to some extent, effective, but with sorghum, with millet, I don't know how effective it's been. Even groundnut gets striga as well. So there's a lot of issues with striga. It used to be a huge problem in parts of Eastern US as well. You get rid of striga pretty much when you put nitrogen fertilizer. At least that's what I've seen in Zimbabwe. If you fertilize a field, or if you stop fertilizing a field, striga appears within a year or two.
Related to your intercropping study, so I assume it's done in those countries where you showed when intercropping is going on, where there may be future further intercropping? Have you done studies to look to see if there's a strong variety by cropping system interaction?
We haven't. I mean, that's why I said IITA, that, Bukhar's work on cowpea is the only example I've seen happening in the field within the CG. But I think we should do more of it. We're actually starting now. We're probably about to plant in Kenya maize pigeon pea. Starting to look at maize pigeon pea intercrop.
So some environments are going to be drier and drier, especially in Africa. Do you think that we should like giving up some crops and switch to other crops, like maize and switch to southern without bringing it up to other crops?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it's a little bit of a paradox because it makes sense biologically to grow other crops, but farmers still want to grow the crops that they like and that are more valuable to them. When I worked in Zimbabwe for many years, as I mentioned, or as was mentioned, I think by Aaron, and ICRISAT, Sister Institute, had a center there in the drier areas near Bulawayo and the closer to Botswana border, which is much drier than where I was in Harare. And so we grew some maize trials there where they were growing mostly sorghum to compare. And the conclusion we came to pretty much was, in a good year, the maize is way better than the sorghum. And in a bad year, neither one of them did very well. So farmers actually, and the other big thing is sorghum required a lot of labor to scare birds. And maize didn't. And so they wanted their kids to go to school. So in the end, in an area where it made sense to grow sorghum and not maize, there were actually more people wanting to grow maize. Eventually that'll change as the climate gets harsh enough. And my favorite crop today is pearl millet because it's so heat tolerant and it's really a resilient crop that I think has a huge future, probably unfortunately because of climate change. But it's a great crop, very highly nutritious in many ways. So that's my new favorite crop.
I have another one from online. It says, thank you so much for the informative presentation. Would you have any opinions or suggestions about the use of phenomic tools in tackling these new traits?
Oh yeah, there's phenomics, can offer a lot of selection power in a breeding program. We're doing a lot of experimentation on high throughput phenotyping, projects looking at even using satellite data to try to make selections. I think that there's a lot of potential, but what we have to watch out for is that it has to be applicable in a mainstream breeding program. So it has to be something that's feasible. We tend to get a lot of really cool phenotyping options that can't be implemented at large scale in the field. And that's why some of these satellite imagery to me are quite appealing. But drones, we tried a lot with drones, and then unfortunately in the last years, a lot of countries have restricted the use of drones. They think they can be misused for reasons, for objectives that are not agricultural in nature. So we've had to back away from using drones in most places where we used to. But absolutely, anything you can do with high throughput phenotyping will be quite valuable, particularly if it can do things like root architecture from radar imaging or from something that would be otherwise an extremely labor intensive approach. If you can streamline it with clever phenomics, that would be great. So that's big future in that. And related to big data, the ability to analyze, it generates a lot of data. And you then have to have the capability to analyze and use those data.
And we kind of related to that, I guess, when I was thinking about some of your blind spot traits, you had listed things like root architecture, microbiome. But to me, those kind of just means to an end. So you measure those things, but what are you trying to get at with those things? Blind reading standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, maybe ultimately that's just helping you understand what you're selecting for. We have a project now in CIMMYT wheat program where we're looking at biological nitrification inhibition, which of course is all about rhizosphere microbiome. And these are exudates from the roots that influence the microbiome, that therefore influences the nitrogen forms that are in the soil from the fertilizer that's been applied. And we'd like to understand what is the influence of the root exudates on the microbiome. But is that something you would breed for? I'm not sure. You might breed for the exudates, not for the microbiome per se. But I do think it's important to be aware, that this is influencing the health of the crop above ground and probably the interactions between crops. In fact, the reason why pigeon pea maize may do better than the sum of the two individually might be because of influence on the microbiome by one of the crop that's beneficial to the other. And do we need to know this or do we need to understand it? Maybe not. We just need to select under the environment to be able to choose the better varieties. But I think it is helpful to understand the science behind it.
Doing a physiology bash after all. Partially. Anyway, we're out of time right now, so let's close up. Kevin will be here for the next half hour or so to mingle and answer any questions you have after the seminar. And he also has a couple of slots open this afternoon yet, if you want to meet with him. So if you do want to schedule a meeting with him, just please get in touch.
To talk about this or anything else that you'd like to discuss, maybe
Good luck
about
with it.
international agriculture or wheat, maize.
Come back and back over in a couple weeks.
Oh, Ed Buckler's coming here.